When you feel angry at injustice, does acting on that emotion make you moral? When compassion moves you to help others, is that truly ethical behavior? Most people would say yes, but during my years developing the critical system in Königsberg, I discovered something troubling. Following emotions, even noble ones, enslaves you to forces beyond your rational control. This challenges everything we typically believe about morality and human dignity. Today, I'll demonstrate why emotional motivation undermines genuine moral worth and how only rational autonomy can secure true human freedom. You'll discover why acting from duty rather than feeling creates authentic moral action, why good intentions rooted in reason matter more than emotional impulses, and how transcending emotional slavery becomes the path to moral dignity. This isn't about suppressing emotions, but about understanding why reason must govern them. The stakes couldn't be higher. Your status as a free, rational being depends on grasping this fundamental distinction between autonomy and heteronomy in moral action. Chapter 1: The Hidden Tyranny of Emotional Motivation. Consider a moment when compassion moved you to extraordinary generosity. Society praises such acts, but I must ask a more penetrating question: were you truly free in that moment? Or were you compelled by forces as external to your rational will as physical coercion? This distinction revolutionized my understanding of human dignity during decades of critical analysis. Emotions operate through what I call heteronomy, determination by something other than your own rational will. When anger drives your sense of justice, when fear motivates your caution, when love inspires your kindness, you're not acting autonomously. You're responding to psychological impulses that arise from your sensible nature, your empirical desires, your conditioned responses to circumstances. This makes you a slave in the most fundamental sense. Your will is determined by forces external to your rational agency. The critical method reveals why this matters so profoundly. Your emotions emerge from your sensible existence, your biological nature, your cultural conditioning, your personal history. They represent what I call pathological motivations, not pathological in the medical sense, but derived from your susceptibility to external influences. When you act from emotion, even seemingly noble emotion, you're not legislating for yourself through reason. You're being legislated to by your psychological constitution. Consider the person who helps others only when moved by sympathy. What happens when that sympathy fails? What happens when their emotional responses shift based on circumstances, fatigue, or personal preference? Their moral action becomes contingent, unreliable, dependent on psychological states beyond rational control. This cannot ground the universal, necessary moral law that human dignity requires. The universalization test exposes this problem clearly. Can you will as universal law that moral action depend on emotional motivation? Absolutely not. Emotions vary among individuals, cultures, and circumstances. A morality based on feeling would be chaotic, subjective, arbitrary, everything that rational moral law must transcend. When I developed the categorical imperative, I discovered that only principles that could govern all rational beings universally could constitute genuine moral law. This doesn't diminish the reality or even the value of emotions in human life, but it locates them properly within the hierarchy of human faculties. Emotions belong to your empirical nature, your existence as a sensible being subject to psychological and physical causation. Moral worth, however, belongs to your intelligible nature, your existence as a rational agent capable of self-determination through practical reason. The synthesis emerges when we understand emotions as data for rational consideration rather than motivational foundations. Your feelings about injustice might alert you to moral problems, but the solution must come through rational analysis of duty, not emotional reaction. Your compassion might reveal opportunities for moral action, but the action's worth depends on its conformity to rational principle, not its emotional source. Chapter 2: How Emotions Violate the Universality Principle. The categorical imperative's first formulation demands that you act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This seemingly simple requirement demolishes emotional motivation as a foundation for moral action. Let me demonstrate why through systematic analysis. Emotions are inherently particular, subjective, and culturally conditioned. When you act from anger, you're following the maxim, act when anger moves you. Can this become universal law? Consider the chaos. Some people experience anger frequently, others rarely. Some cultures encourage emotional expression, others suppress it. Some individuals have quick tempers, others remain calm under pressure. A universal law based on anger would create a moral system dependent on psychological temperament rather than rational principle. The same applies to seemingly positive emotions. Act when compassion moves you cannot be universalized because compassion operates selectively. We feel compassion more readily for those who resemble us, those we understand, those whose suffering we can imagine. Can you will as universal law that moral consideration depend on our capacity for emotional identification? This would create a hierarchy of moral worth based on psychological accessibility rather than rational dignity. During my investigation of practical reason, I discovered that emotions necessarily introduce what I call empirical contingency into moral decision-making. Your emotional responses depend on factors beyond your rational control, your biological constitution, your personal history, your current circumstances, even your physical health. When tired, hungry, or stressed, your emotional responses shift. Can moral law depend on such variable factors? The universalization test reveals another crucial problem. Emotions often conflict with each other and with rational duty. You might feel compassion for a friend's request that conflicts with justice. You might experience loyalty to your group that conflicts with universal human dignity. You might feel personal affection that conflicts with impartial moral consideration. Which emotion should govern? Without rational principle to adjudicate, emotional motivation becomes arbitrary. Consider practical examples from contemporary American life. Someone feels patriotic emotion during wartime. Can act when patriotism moves you become universal law? Different people experience patriotism differently, and some nations' patriotic emotions conflict with others. Or consider someone who feels environmental passion. Can act when ecological emotion moves you be universalized? People's environmental feelings vary dramatically based on their relationship to nature, their economic circumstances, their cultural background. The critical examination of pure reason taught me that knowledge requires universal and necessary conditions. Similarly, morality requires universal and necessary principles that can govern all rational beings regardless of their empirical differences. Emotions, by their very nature, introduce particularity and contingency that undermine this universality. This analysis doesn't deny that emotions might align with moral duty. When your compassion motivates actions that conform to the categorical imperative, the actions remain morally valuable, but their moral worth derives from their conformity to rational principle, not from their emotional source. The feeling of compassion might be psychologically helpful, even psychologically necessary for many people, but it cannot ground moral obligation. The transcendental method reveals that emotions belong to the phenomenal realm of empirical psychology, while moral law belongs to the noumenal realm of rational freedom. Confusing these realms undermines both proper scientific understanding of human psychology and proper moral understanding of human dignity. Only when we clearly distinguish them can we appreciate both our empirical nature as feeling beings and our intelligible nature as moral agents. Chapter 3, The Dignity Test, Treating Yourself as an End When Following Emotions. The second formulation of the categorical imperative reveals another devastating critique of emotional motivation. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. This principle exposes how following emotions often violates human dignity, especially your own. When you act from emotion, you're using yourself as a means to satisfy psychological impulses rather than expressing your rational autonomy. Consider what happens when anger drives your actions. You become an instrument of your rage rather than a self-determining agent. Your capacity for rational deliberation, your ability to choose based on principle, your dignity as a thinking being, all become subordinated to psychological forces. You treat yourself merely as a means for emotional expression rather than honoring yourself as an end capable of moral agency. I invite you to examine honestly how you treat yourself when emotions govern your decisions. During passionate anger, do you respect your own rational nature? Do you honor your capacity for moral reflection? Or do you reduce yourself to a mechanism for venting psychological pressure? The dignity of rational agency requires that you never treat even yourself merely as a means, even as a means to emotional satisfaction. This applies equally to positive emotions. When you act solely from compassion, you're using your agency as an instrument of feeling rather than exercising it autonomously. Your capacity for moral reasoning becomes subordinated to psychological response. While the action might benefit others, you fail to honor your own dignity as a rational being capable of acting from principle rather than impulse. The contemporary American context provides clear examples. Consider someone who votes based on emotional reaction to political rhetoric rather than rational evaluation of policies and principles. They're treating their civic agency, their capacity for reasoned political judgment, merely as a means to express their feelings. They dishonor their own rational dignity and their responsibility as democratic citizens to engage seriously with moral and political questions. Or consider consumer behavior driven by emotional manipulation in advertising. When you purchase products to satisfy artificially stimulated desires, you're treating your economic agency merely as a means to emotional gratification rather than exercising rational autonomy in determining what truly serves your genuine needs and values. The dignity principle also reveals how emotional motivation can lead to treating others merely as means. When anger drives your interactions, you often use others as targets for emotional discharge rather than recognizing their rational dignity. When excessive sympathy governs your relationships, you might treat others as objects of pity rather than respecting their autonomy and agency. But the most subtle violation occurs when you use your own moral agency merely as a means to feel good about yourself. Much charitable action in affluent societies seems motivated by the desire to experience positive emotions about one's generosity rather than genuine respect for human dignity. The warm feeling of being helpful becomes the true end, while moral action becomes merely the means to achieve that psychological satisfaction. This doesn't mean emotions are inherently evil or that you should suppress them entirely. Rather, it means that emotions must be governed by rational principle if you're to maintain human dignity. When duty determines your action and emotions align with duty, you honor both your rational nature and your empirical nature appropriately. The emotion becomes a psychological accompaniment to moral action rather than its determining ground. The transcendental analysis reveals that treating yourself as an end requires acknowledging your nature as both an empirical being with feelings and an intelligible being with rational autonomy. Respecting human dignity means never reducing yourself or others to mere mechanisms for emotional satisfaction, but always maintaining awareness of the rational agency that makes each person irreplaceably valuable. Chapter 4: Goodwill versus Good Feelings, the Foundation of Moral Worth. The opening lines of my groundwork declare that nothing in the world, indeed nothing even beyond the world, can possibly be conceived which could be called good without qualification except a good will. This principle fundamentally distinguishes moral worth from emotional satisfaction and reveals why feelings cannot ground ethical value. Good feelings are contingent, variable, and often deceptive about moral reality. You might feel satisfied after helping someone, But that satisfaction doesn't determine whether your action had moral worth. You might feel guilty about actions that were morally correct, or feel proud about actions that were morally questionable. The feeling serves as psychological reward or punishment, but cannot serve as moral criterion. Goodwill, by contrast, operates through practical reason independent of psychological states. When I act from goodwill, I'm motivated by respect for moral law itself rather than by the psychological satisfaction that might accompany moral action. This respect is itself rational rather than emotional. It's the recognition that moral law expresses my own rational autonomy and the autonomy of all rational beings. Consider the difference practically. Someone motivated by good feelings might help others only when it feels emotionally satisfying, when they're in a good mood, when the recipients seem deserving, when social approval follows. Their helpfulness becomes contingent on psychological and social factors beyond rational control. But someone motivated by goodwill helps others because respect for human dignity demands it, regardless of their emotional state, regardless of social recognition, regardless of the emotional satisfaction it provides. The critical method reveals that goodwill represents the only unconditional value because it's the only motivation that respects the rational autonomy that makes you morally significant in the first place. All other motivations, including emotional motivations, treat rational agency as instrumental to something else: psychological satisfaction, social approval, personal fulfillment, even helping others. Only goodwill honors rational agency as an end in itself. This creates what might seem a paradox. The more you're motivated by feeling good about helping others, the less moral worth your helping possesses. The more you're motivated by respect for duty itself, the greater moral worth your action achieves. This isn't because helping others is bad, but because moral worth depends on the purity of motivation, not the external consequences of action. Contemporary American culture often confuses this distinction catastrophically. We praise people for following their hearts in moral decisions, as if emotional intensity indicated moral validity. We celebrate those who feel passionate about social causes, as if the strength of feeling guaranteed the rightness of position. We encourage people to do what feels right, as if emotions were reliable moral guides. But systematic analysis reveals that emotions can mislead as easily as guide. History provides countless examples of intense emotions supporting deeply immoral causes. People felt passionate about slavery, about religious persecution, about nationalist aggression. They followed their hearts into moral catastrophe. Emotion without rational principle becomes arbitrary at best, destructive at worst. The goodwill operates differently. It examines principles rationally, tests them through universalization, applies them consistently regardless of personal preference or emotional state. Someone acting from goodwill might feel reluctant to fulfill a difficult duty, but fulfills it anyway because rational analysis reveals its moral necessity. They might feel no emotional satisfaction from moral action, but perform it anyway because respect for law demands it. This doesn't make moral life cold or mechanical. Rather, it establishes reliable foundations for ethical action that transcend the variability of psychological states. When emotions align with duty, you can appreciate them as harmonious accompaniments to moral action. When emotions conflict with duty, you can acknowledge them as part of your empirical nature while refusing to let them determine your moral choices. The synthesis emerges in understanding that goodwill creates the only basis for authentic moral community. When people act from shared rational principles rather than variable emotional impulses, they create stable, just, predictable social cooperation that honors everyone's dignity equally. Chapter 5: Moral Freedom versus Emotional Determinism. The antinomy between freedom and determinism dissolves when we understand the distinction between your intelligible and sensible existence. This resolution reveals why emotional motivation represents a form of determinism that undermines genuine moral freedom, while rational motivation expresses authentic autonomy. Your emotions operate through psychological causation within the sensible world. When anger determines your action, you're as causally determined as any physical object. The anger arises from particular circumstances, follows psychological laws, produces predictable behavioral effects. You become a link in the causal chain of empirical psychology rather than a self-determining moral agent. This is why I call emotional motivation heteronomy, determination by something other than your rational will. I invite you to reflect honestly on moments when emotions controlled your behavior. Were you truly free in those moments? Or did you feel compelled, driven, determined by forces beyond your rational control? Most people recognize experientially that emotional compulsion limits their freedom, even when they can't articulate philosophically why this occurs. Moral freedom operates differently. When you act from duty, you're legislating for yourself through practical reason. The moral law doesn't impose itself on you externally. You discover it through your own rational analysis and choose to follow it because it expresses your own autonomous will. This represents genuine self-determination. You're governed by principles you've established through reason rather than by impulses that arise from empirical circumstances. The transcendental method reveals that this freedom occurs in the intelligible realm, where you exist as a rational agent capable of moral choice independent of empirical determination. When you choose moral principle over emotional impulse, you're expressing your membership in the kingdom of ends rather than your subordination to natural causation. Consider practical examples. Someone feels angry about political developments and wants to respond with harsh rhetoric or aggressive action. If they follow this emotional impulse, they're determined by psychological and social forces, their upbringing, their media consumption, their social environment, their biological temperament. But if they pause to examine their duty as rational citizens, consider what principles could be universalized, and choose their response based on moral law rather than emotional reaction, they express genuine freedom. This distinction becomes crucial in contemporary American debates about criminal justice and personal responsibility. The deterministic view suggests that people's actions result entirely from their circumstances, psychology, and social conditioning, which emotions certainly do. But the recognition of moral freedom acknowledges that rational agents can transcend these determining factors through practical reason, which creates the foundation for moral responsibility and legal accountability. The resolution of the freedom determinism antinomy doesn't deny empirical psychology or social conditioning. These operate genuinely within the sensible world. But it recognizes that rational beings also exist in the intelligible world where moral freedom operates. You are simultaneously a causally determined empirical being and a free rational agent. The question becomes which realm governs your moral choices. Emotional motivation keeps you within the realm of empirical determination. Even positive emotions like compassion operate through psychological causation, your neural responses, your learned associations, your cultural conditioning. Following emotions means following the causal chains of empirical psychology rather than exercising rational autonomy. Rational motivation expresses your intelligible freedom. When you act from duty, you're not caused to act by empirical factors but choose to act based on principles you've established through reason. This choice transcends empirical determination while operating within empirical circumstances. The practical importance cannot be overstated. Moral education should focus on developing rational autonomy rather than emotional sensitivity. Social policy should recognize both empirical factors that influence behavior and rational capacity that makes moral responsibility possible. Personal development should aim at strengthening your ability to act from principle rather than merely following emotional impulses. This creates genuine hope for moral progress. If people were entirely determined by emotions and circumstances, moral improvement would be impossible. But because rational beings can transcend empirical determination through practical reason, moral development becomes possible both individually and socially. Chapter 6: The Rational Hope for Moral Dignity Beyond Emotional Slavery. The postulates of practical reason reveal why transcending emotional motivation becomes not merely philosophically interesting but practically necessary for authentic human flourishing. The highest good, the synthesis of virtue and happiness, requires rational agents who can act from duty rather than emotional compulsion, creating the foundation for both individual dignity and social justice. When I examine what practical reason necessarily presupposes for moral life to be meaningful, three postulates emerge: the freedom of the will, the immortality of the soul, and the existence of God. Each connects directly to why emotional slavery undermines human dignity while rational autonomy expresses our highest nature. The postulate of freedom presupposes that rational agents can transcend empirical determination through moral choice. This becomes impossible if emotions govern our actions, since emotions operate through psychological causation within the sensible world. Only when reason governs the will can we exercise the freedom that moral responsibility requires. Without this freedom, moral concepts like duty, guilt, praise, and blame become meaningless. The postulate of immortality emerges from the infinite task of moral perfection. Rational beings must be able to progress indefinitely toward moral completeness, what I call holiness of will. This progress requires developing our capacity to act from duty rather than inclination, gradually purifying our motivation until moral law becomes our spontaneous choice rather than a struggle against emotional impulses. A finite lifespan cannot contain this infinite development. The postulate of divine existence ensures that virtue and happiness can ultimately harmonize. In the empirical world, following emotions often brings immediate satisfaction while following duty often requires sacrifice. This apparent conflict between moral worth and personal fulfillment creates rational discord unless we can hope that moral virtue will ultimately receive proportionate happiness. Divine providence provides the rational ground for believing that the universe supports moral endeavor rather than undermining it. These postulates transform our understanding of emotional versus rational motivation. Acting from emotion keeps you within the finite, empirical realm where moral progress remains limited and moral meaning remains questionable. Acting from rational duty connects you to infinite moral development and ultimate moral harmony that transcend empirical limitations. Consider what this means for contemporary American life. The cultural emphasis on emotional authenticity and self-expression often leads to moral relativism and social fragmentation. People follow their feelings, but feelings differ dramatically among individuals and groups. Without shared rational principles, social cooperation becomes increasingly difficult and moral discourse becomes impossible. But practical reason offers rational hope for moral community. When people act from shared rational principles rather than variable emotional impulses, they create stable foundations for justice, cooperation, and mutual respect. The categorical imperative provides universal moral law that can guide diverse individuals toward common ethical standards that honor everyone's dignity equally. This hope extends to global challenges requiring rational cooperation, climate change, technological ethics, international justice, economic inequality. These problems cannot be solved through emotional responses alone, which tend to be tribal, short-term, and conflicted. They require rational analysis of universal principles and sustained commitment to duty even when emotions fluctuate. The rational hope also addresses personal meaning and purpose. Emotional motivation provides only temporary satisfaction and remains vulnerable to changing circumstances, aging, loss, and disappointment. But rational moral commitment connects you to eternal values that transcend empirical contingency. Your dignity as a rational agent becomes the permanent foundation for meaning that neither time nor circumstance can destroy. The practical cultivation of rational hope requires systematic moral education focused on developing practical reason rather than merely emotional intelligence. Schools should teach ethical analysis, moral reasoning, and principled decision-making. Families should model rational discussion of moral questions rather than merely expressing preferences and feelings. Public discourse should emphasize evidence, argument, and universal principles rather than emotional manipulation and tribal loyalty. This doesn't require suppressing emotions or becoming coldly calculating. Rather, it requires proper ordering of human faculties with reason governing emotion rather than emotion governing reason. Emotions can provide valuable information and motivation, but rational principle must determine moral choice if human dignity is to be maintained and moral progress is to be possible. Chapter 7: Applying Rational Autonomy to Contemporary American Moral Challenges. The practical application of rational autonomy over emotional motivation becomes crucial when examining contemporary American moral challenges where feelings often overwhelm principled analysis. Let me demonstrate how the categorical imperative provides guidance in specific areas where emotional responses typically dominate public discourse. Consider bioethical questions surrounding end-of-life care. Families facing terminal illness often make decisions based on grief, fear, guilt, or desperate hope rather than rational consideration of what respects human dignity. The categorical imperative requires asking, can I will as universal law that medical decisions be made primarily through emotional response? The universalization test reveals the chaos this would create. Different families would reach contradictory decisions based on variable psychological factors rather than consistent principles. Instead, rational analysis focuses on treating the patient always as an end, never merely as a means to others' emotional needs. This might require difficult decisions that conflict with family members' emotional preferences but honor the patient's rational autonomy and human dignity. The principle provides stable guidance independent of the emotional turmoil that necessarily accompanies such situations. Technology ethics presents another arena where emotional reactions often substitute for rational analysis. Many Americans feel either technophobic anxiety or uncritical enthusiasm about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, or social media platforms. But feelings cannot determine whether these technologies respect human dignity or undermine it. The humanity formulation demands examining whether technological development treats people as ends or merely as means. Does social media design respect users' rational autonomy or manipulate their psychological vulnerabilities for profit? Do genetic modifications enhance human dignity or reduce people to collections of improvable traits? These questions require systematic rational analysis rather than emotional reactions. Political discourse exemplifies the dangers of emotional motivation in democratic society. Contemporary American politics increasingly operates through tribal loyalty, personal resentment, and emotional manipulation rather than principled debate about universal justice. Can you will as universal law that political decisions be made through emotional appeal rather than rational argument? This would destroy the possibility of democratic deliberation and reduce politics to competing emotional tribes. Rational political engagement requires examining what policies could be universalized while treating all citizens as ends in themselves. This might support positions that conflict with your emotional preferences or tribal loyalties. But respect for rational law demands transcending such empirical attachments in favor of universal justice. Economic ethics reveals similar patterns. Consumer culture encourages following emotional impulses, buying what feels good, spending to satisfy psychological needs, pursuing wealth for status and security. But the categorical imperative questions whether these patterns respect human dignity or reduce people to instruments of economic manipulation. Environmental challenges require especially careful distinction between emotional and rational motivation. Many Americans feel passionate about climate change, but passion alone cannot determine proper policy responses. Some feel apocalyptic anxiety that leads to extreme positions. Others feel defensive anger that leads to denial. Neither emotional response provides reliable moral guidance. Rational environmental ethics examines what relationship with nature could be universalized while respecting human dignity across generations and cultures. This requires careful analysis, balancing present needs with future responsibilities, individual freedom with collective action, economic development with ecological sustainability. Emotions might motivate concern, but reason must determine response. Criminal justice provides perhaps the clearest example of emotional versus rational approaches to social problems. Victim impact statements appeal to emotions, deterrence arguments appeal to consequences, rehabilitation programs appeal to sympathetic feelings about human potential. But none of these emotional or consequentialist approaches addresses the fundamental question: what treatment of criminals respects their human dignity while protecting society's rational needs? The categorical imperative requires treating even criminals as ends in themselves, rational agents capable of moral choice rather than merely dangerous objects to be contained or manipulated. This might support restorative justice approaches that focus on moral education and rational accountability rather than purely punitive or purely therapeutic responses. These applications demonstrate that rational autonomy provides practical guidance for navigating complex moral terrain where emotional responses often conflict with each other and with principled analysis. The categorical imperative doesn't solve these problems easily, but it provides systematic methodology for approaching them rationally rather than merely following whatever feels compelling at the moment. Conclusion. The systematic examination reveals that following emotions enslaves you to empirical forces beyond rational control, while acting from duty expresses the moral freedom that constitutes human dignity. This isn't abstract philosophical speculation but practical wisdom essential for navigating contemporary moral challenges with integrity and consistency. Your emotions belong to your sensible nature, subject to psychological causation and cultural conditioning. They provide valuable information about your empirical circumstances but cannot ground universal moral law. When you follow emotional impulses, you become determined by factors external to your rational will, your upbringing, your chemistry, your social environment, your immediate circumstances. But your capacity for rational moral choice belongs to your intelligible nature, where you exist as a self-determining agent capable of acting from universal principles. When you act from duty discovered through practical reason, you express authentic autonomy and honor the dignity that makes you irreplaceably valuable. The categorical imperative provides the methodology for this moral freedom. Test your principles through universalization. Treat humanity always as an end. Act as a legislating member of the kingdom of ends. These formal criteria enable you to transcend emotional slavery while maintaining proper appreciation for your empirical nature. I challenge you to examine your own moral decisions with rigorous honesty. Are you acting from rational principle or emotional impulse? Are you treating yourself and others as ends or merely as means to psychological satisfaction? The stakes couldn't be higher. Your status as a free, dignified, moral agent depends on developing the rational autonomy that elevates you above empirical determination into the realm of authentic moral choice.